kind of the goal of that talk is to explain a little bit why sheaf theory could be useful for persistent homology, in particular multi-parameter persistence. And I will be focusing, as Magnus was telling on Wednesday, especially on level set persistent homology, which means that multi means 2, which is already the big gap anyway in persistent homology. All right, so just let me recall hopefully quickly a few facts about the standard persistence homology or cohomology in one parameter. It has a few fundamental properties. The first one would be once you have been applying your data, getting nice temperature complexes and stuff, you can compute everything with linear algebra. And meaning you don't have to compute, the computer can do it for you way faster, way more efficiently. So that's a good thing. The second thing is that the data is really given by combinatorial data called the barcode for the persistence homology. So you can really include something in something purely combinatorial, which is easy to store on a computer and give to a computer. And then you can compare the barcodes. And that's where you need the notion of distances, which can be defined either on the barcode directly, or you're going to compute them with a computer, or defined at the level of the invariance, which are called the interleaving distances, which are good to understand what properties they are. All right, so that's the standard thing that we need to consider when we are going to look at level sets and multi-parameter persistence too. So, well, let's go over these two things fast. So, we're recalling what's the definition of a persistent object in any category, and for us, categories would be essentially vector spaces or chain complexes, actually, of vector spaces later. So it's just a functor from R is seen as a category. We've seen R with its usual order relation. You see. All right, and I will be also considering a lot of the time cohomology, meaning I will be considering functors going to C or and not to C. Basically, I'm going to consider cohomology because I want to speak about sheaves, and sheaves are naturally cohomology and not homology. That's the main reason. All right. So I will usually consider all the persistent cohomology at once, meaning I'm taking the direct sum over all possible degrees. To consider it as being not a graded vector space, a persistent graded vector space, but a persistent, sorry, not a persistent vector spaces, but a persistent graded vector space. Just meaning considering all degrees of cohomology groups at once. And so the key theorem giving you barcodes, the decomposition theorem, which is basically saying that if you have a sufficiently finite dimensional persistent module, it has a unique decomposition in the sum of very nice indecomposable modules because they're basically one-dimensional and they're supported on an interval. Meaning Ki is just the thing which is 0 with anywhere where you're not in the interval and just K in the interval. And the structure map that you have from S to T are the identity when they can, meaning they are both in the interval, and that's 0 if not, because that's the only thing possible in that case. So that's a very powerful theorem. It's telling you that to understand the persistent homology or cohomology system, you only need to know the multiset of interval, which is called the barcode. All right. And the notion of thing that you need is so you have the interleaving distance, which is basically, well, I'm not probably going to recall it, I will recall it later anyway in another context, but it's just saying that interleaving distance, if you compute it at not at the level of the barcodes, but at the level of the persistent modules, it's just saying that two persistent modules are interleaved if you can go, if you have map from one to the other, where you shift. So the bracket epsilon means you have been looking not to G, but to the persistent module, which in at time t is G of T plus epsilon. And you're just saying that you want that the canonical map going from F to H to epsilon factors for G, and similarly from the map going from G to epsilon. That's what it means to be epsilon interleaved. And the interleaving distance is the infimum of all the possible epsilon, possibly that can possibly be infinite actually, of the possible interleaving between them. All right. So that's the really brief recollection of things on one parameter persistence. And so basically one wish to extend that story to get in actually several directions. But basically the goal is to have better invariants and better descriptors of what's going on. And there are like at least three directions which are really not mutually excluding. I mean, they can use both of them. The first one is multi-parameter persistent, that was explained in details in Magnus' talk, and that was a really great talk, by the way. And that I'm going to speak about that soon. There are two other ideas which are basically use a lot of homotopical or homological algebra in the story. So the first one would be just to say, well, try to get refined invariants which are really closer to the persistent homotopy type of a space and not just the homology. And there are several ways of doing that and a lot of theory. That's not what I'm going to speak about today. I'm going to speak about something related, which is basically interpret persistence as objects which are actually kind of sheaves and coming from the derived category of sheaves. And in that settings, then you can extend that notion of persistence. And you can use the fact that there is a really big, well understood machinery to deal with homotopy structures of sheaves and homotopical algebra of sheaves, which you can then therefore import into the persistence picture. All right. So essentially, the idea of doing either one or two or both, so of two of actually, is really to see more of the persistent homotopy type. And multi-parameter is basically more about well, getting refined invariant from persistent theory, but also allowing like to have like more functions in the picture or more parameters and so on. So okay, so multi-parameter persistence, as we say, is just we do exactly the same thing as one parameter, except of looking from map from R to C. We're going to map from the product of R t times empty parameters. And now we have like partially ordered set given by the product of these points. So there's a big issue when we go from one to multi-parameter persistence is that, well, we don't have a very nice theory of barcode, and that's not possible to have one because the representation theory of these things is pretty wide, which should not stop you, but telling you that you should not really try to do the whole theory at once, but try to find ideas like in Magnus' talk to essentially use kind of invariants for the theory of representation, or that's what I'm going to speak about. Try to use like a subfamily of multi-parameter persistence, which is going to be the case of the level sets, which can have better properties. And yeah, I should say, I mean, this passage from one to many parameter, it's really becoming one. It's kind of for the same reason that we understand very well polynomials in one generators, but that's starting to be way harder once you go to two generators and so on. And that's an analogy which is really precise in some sense. It's really the same issue. All right, so so let's go to the main example of two-parameter persistence that I mentioned. It's the level sets. So we've been seeing the sub-level sets already today in the first talk, actually. So the sub-level sets, that's the standard thing that you get from Morse theory or whatever, which means you're looking to the homology of the pre-image of the interval minus length infinity to t when you have a real function, a real valued function. And since if t becomes bigger, minus infinity t is inside minus infinity s, then you get a persistence structure as a space. And if you apply the homology or cohomology, you get a co-persistence or persistent module by functoriality of homology and cohomology. So the level set of a continuous function, that's the same thing, except that you don't force yourself to start in the bottom. You're just fixing 2 points, s and t, with s smaller than t. I guess well, they were x and y, so that's fine. And you're looking to the pre-image of the interval. So I'm writing minus xy for the letter. It's just for me, it's my way of writing these things. It's either you go over the diagonal or below the diagonal, and you have to choose if it's xy or minus xy. But that's just my way of doing this. So you're going to look to the pre-image of minus xy, that's an interval, and you're computing the cohomology of these things in every degree. And with that choice, whenever a is smaller than x and p is smaller than y, and therefore ab is smaller than xy with my order, then you get an inclusion of the interval minus ab inside minus xy, which gives you again a persistent structure in the usual way. So we have these two parameter persistence module. Right, you can notice that of course it's not zero only if x plus y is bigger than 0, if that interval is empty, and therefore you get 0. So it's really living above the diagonal, the one going that way. I never know if it's the first or second, but all right. So one of the key things that you can kind of see by hand, and that would be a corollary of what I would say at the end, is that actually, if you look to multi-parameter persistence module, unlike the world theory, they have whatever the function is, whatever x is, they have a very nice barcode decompositions. So let me define 4 kinds of blocks you can do in R2, which, well, I'm going to show a picture and maybe come back to that after. That will be easier to see on the pictures. So the picture describes actually 3 types of blocks, but I will say what's the 4th one. So let's start with the green one in the middle. That's what I would call a vertical block. It's just, well, 2 vertical lines and everything in between. And the lines can be inside or not, whatever. You have all these choices. You have the obvious horizontal blocks, which would be the same thing, but now your lines are horizontals. Okay, that's infinite. And then you have birth blocks. So birth blocks are like the thing in blue, which is here. So that's a quadrant which goes towards infinity in the direction of h plus. And they can start below the diagonal, meaning it's going to be 0 if we go for our multiplier, or above the diagonal, which is like the yellow thing there. So the yellow thing is going to be what I call a positive birth block, and I think is a non-positive one. And then you have like which I would call the dual of birth block, is the death block, which is like the kind of red thing here. So this is again a quadrant, but going now in the lower direction. All right, so that's the 4 types of blocks you can have. Those 4 types of blocks I can describe. And I should say that's already in the picture that positive birth block and death block, they have like kind of the duality you can do, because whenever you have like, for instance, this red thing, I can build a birth block starting precisely at its endpoint. And depending whether or not my border are inside, I can put them or not in the yellow thing, and vice versa, of course. All right, so that's what was described and given by like mathematical formula there, but that's really what's there. Kind of close to each block, you can associate a 2-parameter persistence module defined by the usual formula. Is that it's k if it's you put k if your parameters are inside your block, and 0 is where with obvious transition path. So what I want to say is that if you have a level set persistent module, then it has a unique decomposition into these blocks. Well, again, assuming finite dimensionality and so on. So you can always write it as the sum of these blocks. But there is something in which is in italic there, is that it's not exactly the complete story, in the sense that if I'm putting whatever blocks I want, then that may not correspond to the level set of some functions. In fact, there is something very precise you can say, is that anytime if you have a level set, anytime you will have something like a red dev block, then you should have in the picture the yellow one, which is going to be in degree shifted by 1. Where that's the statement we will get in the end, and that will be, it's written as a corollary because it's going to be a corollary of what I say at the end. And it's going to be from studying these things as being coming from sheaves. All right, but that's saying you that these things, once you know this corollary and actually exactly what are the possible blocks, then you can study them using usual ideas of persistence, because you have very simple barcodes and you can try to translate everything from their interleaving distance in terms of barcodes, and that works pretty well. So I kind of give you the end of the talk already, but I guess it's fine. All right, so here is my favorite basic example of stuff where you can study level set persistence. Is I have a circle, the standard unit circle in R2. And I'm projecting down vertically in the first thing by the first vertical projection. So I'm sending x, y to x. And the second one is really the stupid map, which sends my circle to the constant 0. They are both continuous functions, and I can study level sets for them. So which are given by section. It's very easy. For the first one, it's very easy. Either your open sets contain 0, and then you have the coverage of a circle, or not, and you have nothing. And for the second one, if you are in middle -1 and 1, then you get 2 intervals. Sometimes you get only 1 interval, sometimes double circle, sometimes nothing. So that can be summarized by these barcodes. So on the left, you have the barcodes of F. It's written here. In degree 0 on the top, in degree 1. And in the right, you have the barcodes for P, which are really simple. They are the same in degree 0 and 1, and it depends whether you see 0, 0 or not in your interval. So there are two non-positive birth codes right now, which should not have been in yellow, but that's it. But anyway. And on the other side, you have a birth block, a non-positive birth block, which is in blue, UK everywhere, and you have a dead block right there. And you can see that you do actually have in the big one the what's the joule of my dead block. All right, that's what it is. Anyway, so that thing that I've been saying, that you know that this dead block comes with associated blocks, joule blocks in degree shifted by 1. That's telling you that when you're doing persistence, especially in multi-parameter and stuff like that, there is an interaction between things in various degrees. So the idea of studying persistence and interleaving doing degree-wise is efficient in some way, but miss a lot of things. And the idea of doing higher homotopy theories or sheaf is precisely, well, I think actually it's written there, is precisely to be able to compare things in different degrees. Like homotopy operation can have different degrees and send things in degree I to degree 2i or whatever. And the same thing when you're doing, especially when we're doing the interleaving distances, comparison of functions and sheaves, and you can have function which goes from a sheaf to a sheaf shifted. That makes sense, and that are sensitive to the theory. So that's the main goal of this thing, and that's the reason why you want to look at that. One of the reasons, at least. All right. So now I have to say a few things about derived categories of sheaves, actually, and sheaves. But anyway, so let's start with sheaves. So I will have like topological spaces. When you have topological spaces, you have like the poset of open subset in X, the inclusion, which is going to be the thing on which we are defining our pre-sheaves. So pre-sheaf on X will just be a functor from the opposite category of X to C in the standard way. So meaning that anytime you have an open, you have something in C. Anytime you have a U inside V, you get something from F of the big open to F of the small open, which is usually called restriction. Right, so the standard basic example being like you take a topological space, you take continuous functions, and that's defining a sheaf by substituting to any open U, continuous function on U. And then restriction in the usual sense of restriction of functions. That's where the name comes from anyway. All right, and a sheaf is a pre-sheaf which satisfies an additional condition, very often called the local to global conditions, which I've been writing that way because that's my favorite way. It's not necessarily the first one you see in the book, but that's equivalent to that. He's saying that if I have a big open U and an open cover of U by opens W, then the value of F on U is actually given by the following limit formula in your category C. You need to have limits in C for this to make sense, but that's not going to be a problem for us. And what does that mean? So yeah, in that limit, you basically have the product of both the F of W, and the true arrow maps are basically saying that whenever I have W I0 intersection W I1, I can see it either as in W I0 or either in W I1, and that's giving me my two parallel arrows. And so saying that thing is an isomorphism is just saying that what it means concretely is that if you have an open cover WI and you have value of your sheaves on each WI that agrees on the intersections, well, there is one and only one possible value for your sheaves at U. That's just what it means, which is obvious for functions on the space as a condition. All right, and there's a slight notion that I won't speak too much about, which is the notion of the value of a sheaf at a point, because I mean, this is defined on opens, not on points. But you can say what it means at the point. That's called the stroke at the point X. And basically, you look at the limit of the value of F of U whenever you take all the neighborhoods of your point X. You make them smaller and smaller, and you get what you call the limit at X. So I should say that if you have a pre-sheaf, you get automatically a sheaf because there is a functor, which is a right adjoint, which is essentially sending, sorry, it's actually, which is transforming any pre-sheaf into a sheaf, which is called the sheafification functor. And yeah, I haven't seen it, but of course we make all of this in categories where, of course, since our objects are functors, our morphisms are natural transformations. So meaning maps that commute with restrictions. All right. So as I said, we've been interested in the case where C is relative vector space and chain complexes of relative vector spaces. And then I will write mod kx for this category of sheaves of relative vector spaces because that's the standard notation I've been growing up with. All right, so the first example I wanted to say, because it's going to pop up all the time, is that you have a sheaf, a standard sheaf, which is going to be, I didn't write it, but it's going to be written as being k underline x, which is the sheaf which to any open U associate a locally constant function from U to k, which I could have been saying that being just continuous function from U to k with discrete topology. And k is my base field, whatever you want to be. In other words, that just means it's constant function on every connected open subset of U. And that's the sheaf associated to the thing, which would be the stupid constant pre-sheaf, which should be just be constant things. All right. That's a nice, very simple sheaf that you always have for any space X. It's going to be like our ground sheaf in some sense, for which we're studying. All right, and then there is another example which I've really been describing, but it's the idea which is going to be very similar to the thing we were describing when we were doing persistence. We have like a persistence module associated to any interval, for instance, or any subset of R2, which was defined by saying you take K whenever T is inside your interval and 0 if not. There is something similar for a nice subset of X. Essentially, if you take closed, open, or intersection of these things, you can define a sheaf delta KZ, which has the similar property, which is going to be its value at every point in time, meaning its talk is K and it's 0 everywhere else. So it's harder to define exactly than what we do for persistence, but that's a similar story. And that's going to be kind of playing the role of our barcode later, obviously. All right. So now there are going to be like 2 slides, which are going to be probably harder, but that's I need to go from there at some point. So let's do it. So sheaves with value in vector spaces or chain complexes or whatever form the Abelian categories. Simply because they are, well, they were coming from categories of functors, so with value in Abelian categories, that's the only reason. And therefore, they have a nice homotopical homological algebra. So let me recall a few things. There's a notion of equivalence for sheaves, which is called with equivalence of chain complexes or quasi-isomorphism. It's just maps between sheaves, which when you pass to homology, give you isomorphisms. And once you're there, you can construct the usual derived category of sheaves, which you can see as being the, well, what you take by taking chain complexes of sheaves and inverting this notion of quasi-isomorphism. You can do it very brutally like this or be smarter, but that doesn't really matter for what I'm going to say. And let us note that, that this is the standard thing, but there is like an enrichment of that thing, which is the infinity category associated to that, which is basically the infinity category of chain complexes of sheaves, which we won't need really, but some of the statements I'm going to say can actually be enriched at that level. All right, and since we need finiteness things, then we probably most of the time look at dB of X, which really means things which have finite cohomology groups. Cohomology groups in finite degrees. All right, so every nice functor can be derived in sheaves, in particular the functors of morphisms from sheaf from F to G. You can derive it as a right in the right, and that gives you things well defined in derived categories, which are nice. And they are nice in the sense that they do what I was saying before, is that if you look to the degree I cohomology of that derived functor, this is the same thing as maps from F to G shifted in the, so note this bracket I means something different from persistence. I'm sorry, it just means G where you have been shifting the degree by I. Yeah. Yeah, so these Combogee groups, they see this X, this R arm, they see a maps of various degrees and they intertwine the various degrees. And incidentally, I can tell you what is the Combogee group of a sheaf. It's basically the same thing as this xi, where you start with kx, value in f. So for those who have seen like things like a group Combogee, that's essentially the same thing, except that you replace your base group by k of x. Yeah. All right. Okay, so now let's go back to the story of looking to persistence as sheaf. So there is something very easy you can do at the first. Is first, and we have a partial order. Well, let's assume that this is going to be true, I guess, after. Yeah, this is going to be true all along after. So you can use this partial order to define the Alexandrov topology as usual. So, which is, I mean, really the topology you get from the process by just translating the combinatorics into some opens. So you have an Alexandrov open if you have that condition. I'm going to write R2 subscript al to say that it's R2 with the Alexandrov topology, not the usual one. R2 with nothing would be the usual R2 with its Euclidean topology. Right, and the Alexandrov topology that gives you to say that persistence modules or two-parameter persistence modules, they are precisely sheaves because of these results, which is basically due to Curie or Peshiwa-Shepard, depending on how you're writing it. Is that there is an equivalence of abelian categories between functors from persistent modules to sheaves over R2 with the Alexandrov topology. So that's essentially telling you that now you can think of the persistence theory as coming from sheaves, and you can apply all the machinery of derived category of sheaves to persistence by that means. And that's what they're going to do. But I mean, anytime you will have R2 with Alexandrov topology, I'm really thinking two-parameter persistence as usual. All right. So there are other topology, of course, you can put on R2, starting with the usual one. And there is one which is very close from the Alexandrov topology, which is the gamma topology, which is essentially saying that so gamma will be my my cone, which is the lower quadrant, R negative to the square. And the gamma topology is basically saying that you want only standard opens of R2, which are stable when you're adding gamma. So things going that direction. So that's going to look like the Alexandrov topology, but the main thing we have from there is that now these things are actually real opens in R2, and that will allow you to connect Euclidean things with Alexandrov, with gamma topology. And then it's very easy to go from gamma topology to Alexandrov because they look like the same, some of the opens, except that you've been changing things which are definitely not opens R2 into opens. All right, so now the big thing that Peshiwa-Shepard found is that they could be able to generalize the notion of interleaving distance to the level of sheaves, and sheaves in R2, R2 gamma, and so on. And they can do that in the derived category already. So putting all the homotopical information at once. So I'm not really, I mean, I'm writing definition, but that's not a definition because I'm telling you what it is. Because they could require a bit too much of explaining stuff in sheaves. But the thing is that we have a notion of what is called the convolution product in sheaves. And what is important is that for sheaf F, you can define something which I'm going to write F subscript epsilon, which is going to play the role of taking a persistent module and shifting it and doing like the transforming in F T plus epsilon, which is defined taking this convolution product with K on the closed ball of radius epsilon of R2. So what it means, and that means that's a derived tensor product of sheaves. So you can think of it as being kind of taking F, you're tensoring it with that thing in some sense. Not exactly that, but it's a rough idea, it's an rough idea. And the idea is you can think of that as something that fattens the support of your sheaf by epsilon. Where you have to be careful because again, everything is chain complexes, so there are various degrees and things can become bigger in some degrees and become smaller in other degrees. But that's by an amount of epsilon. Anyway, you have this notion, and you have the two properties which are similar to what you get from usual persistence is that f of epsilon tau is the same thing as f of epsilon plus tau. So like the composition, and you also have canonical morphism from f alpha to f beta. So when alpha is bigger than beta or smaller than beta, depending if you are with persistence or co-persistent stuff. Here should be in the correct direction because that should be in co-persistent things. All right. So once you have that, then you can basically mimic the definition of the interleaving distance using this f subscript epsilon instead of the shifting. And that's called the convolution distance or interleaving distance. If you want to give the same name, that doesn't matter. So basically, you say that two sheaves are going to be epsilon interleaved if you have a map from f epsilon to g, from g epsilon to f, such that this diagram are commutative, meaning the canonical map going from f to epsilon to f factors through g epsilon via f and g, and the shifting. And similarly, the canonical map from g to epsilon to g factors from f from the same maps. And again, once you have that, then you can look to the infimum of the epsilon for which there are epsilon intervals. That's I've been writing it for usual R2, but that's same thing for gamma topology, obviously. And if you do that for Alexandrov, it's just the usual interleaving notion. All right. So this convolution distance, there are homotopical enrichment of the usual thing. They take into account all the commutative degrees by definition. We have been forcing them to work in the derived category. And now there are like a couple of results that were proved by Kashiwara-Shapira. The first one is that if I'm doing the conservative over a real, over R, the real line, but with the usual topology, then you still have a nice Berkouk decomposition because, well, assuming some finiteness dimension which are hidden in the world constructible, there exists a decomposition of f in a direct sum of sheaves supported on the intervals I alpha, as I defined before. And I have an index I alpha, this is because I'm looking to everything in all degrees at once. So I have to say that every interval should have a degrees, which correspond to the degrees in which I'm putting this k I alpha. So k I alpha bracket minus I alpha means this k I alpha in degree, in cohomological degree I alpha. So you have this big decomposition of all these sheaves in this family, and therefore you have again a multiset of graded intervals I alpha, comma small I alpha. Okay, and that's a decomposition which is unique to isomorphism in the usual sets. So it's really like a generalization, but like for a Kleinian sheaf, not just one persistent module. That's a nice thing. And Kashiwara-Shapira have extended that to higher dimension, but that's not as nice, of course. But there's a notion of what they call piecewise linear sheaves, which really essentially means that your sheaves can be decomposed in sums of stuff which have support in nice polytopes. All right, now, which is kind of similar for higher dimension, but I won't need that because I'm interested in two-parameter persistence. So let me make another remark, is that the convolution product, which was defined in the category of sheaves and derived categories, so absolutely not easy to compute at all. At least in the real one for R, well, we can prove that actually you can compute it by combinatorial method, by matching periods. And that was the result we did with Nicolas Berkouk. Is that you can take this nice decomposition and define a bottleneck distance inside this chi alpha, which gives you exactly the convolution distance, and forces you to compare some bars in some degrees with bars in higher degrees when you do that. But I mean, there is a way of doing that and a precise way of matching these things and doing it, which means you can then give it to a computer and let it do the work. I mean, if you know to program, which I don't, but anyway, so that can be effective in the VR. So, okay, so now I need to, my goal is going to relate level sets with sheaves, and that's what I'm going to do now. And now I need to say something nice with category of sheaves is that we have plenty of operations, of functorial operations that can be defined at the level of sheaves and derived category of sheaves. And the only one I need to speak about now, even if separately I've been already using some before, like in the definition of the convolution, is the direct image, which luckily is the easiest one to define. So the direct image functor, that's a map which from sheaves to x to sheaves to y, which is just defined that if you have a continuous map from x to y, Well, if you have an open in Y, its preimage is an open in X, and therefore you can put any sheaf on X and apply it to the preimage F inverse F minus 1 of Z of any open in Y. That's giving you something which actually is a sheaf on Y. And that's the F star version. So that's not an exact functor. So if you want to pass to the derived category, you have to right derive it by standard means, meaning replacing your sheaves by injective resolutions. But that's a standard operation you can do. And therefore, there's a left exact functor, which is written as RF star, just R to say that it's a right derived functor from the derived category of X to the derived category of Y. So this thing allows you to see sheaves on some topological space X and sending to some sheaves on topological space Y. And there are a lot of properties it satisfies. But I'm going to say two things about one is there is a first way of comparing Alexandrov two-parameter persistence with gamma topology, in the sense that there is a fully faithful functor from the derived category of the gamma topology with respect to the true persistence. I'm writing it as a R alpha star without giving you alpha because it's almost the same construction, except it's not given by a map, a continuous map. It's given by a morphism of site, but that's not very important here. It's just what I say is you're looking to your Alexandrov open and you're just making, your Alexandrov and you're just making opens by basically blowing them a little bit. But anyway, that proposition that's telling you that you can see the gamma topology inside the two-parameter persistence. And therefore, all the homological algebra convolution we had before, we can see it there too. That's the result of Berkouk and François Petit, by the way. And now let's go to level set as sheaves. And I'm going to use my operation R star again, in the sense that now if I have a continuous function from X to R, well, I can take my sheaves on X and send them to sheaves on R. That's nice because we have a nice decomposition for sheaves on R, as we have been seeing before. And further, as I said, we have a canonical object in the sheaves on X, which is Kx, the locally constant function on X with value in K. So you can apply R star to this Kx and get a sheaf in R, which is going to be a nice usually if X is not too bad, meaning locally constructible direct compact. Really not too bad for anything you want to do in persistence. Then if you do that, then this R star of Kx, you can compute it, and you can compute its cohomology groups. And well, they are precisely the things you get from the level sets. So this R star of Kx gives you back the cohomology of the level sets. So that's one way of interpreting level set as persistence, except that we haven't really fully done the work because this R star is a sheaf on R. The level set were something in the true persistence, and we haven't really connected these two things yet, except by that formula. So what we are going to do, we are going to use again the same kind of idea to relate sheaves on R with R2 things. And the stupid thing we're going to do is that we can see R, we can basically send R in R2 by using the diagonal. So sending X to the points of coordinate minus XX, which is continuous with respect to the gamma topology. And therefore, we can derive this functor to get something from derived category of sheaves on R to derived category of sheaves on R2 with gamma topology. And we have been saying that we can send the sheaves on R2 with gamma topology to the true persistence, and then we can compose. And that's what I'm going to write as being capital psi, that this functor. And sheaves on R to sheaves on the Alexandrov topology. All right, so, and here comes the theorem with Steve, Nicolas, and myself. Is that we have a couple of results that comes from this thing. First is that this functor R star is an isometry actually. So it sends the convolution distance in R to the convolution distance given by the Chihuahua Shakira in R2 gamma, which again is going to tell us that now the image of this thing, we will be able to understand the interleaving distance in the Alexandrov topology through the convolution distance in R, which, as we've been saying, is doable essentially by N and by matching process. And that functor C is fully faithful, which is telling us that the image of the sheaves in R are actually going to be like a sub-category of the category of the derived category of sheaves of true persistence, let's say. And well, so if you take a continuous function from R and so F is like finite dimensional enough, then the imbalance of this functor psi on R star of kx is exactly the true parameter persistence module from before, which identified these two things. All right, so that theorem basically tell us something, especially in the sense that now we can use the fact that we know the classification of sheaves on R to say something about the chloride I was speaking before, in the sense that, of course, you can study what becomes your nice barcode on R when you send them to persistence parameter, and that's this formula, meaning a closed interval is going to become a non-positive Bird block. The nice thing is that an open interval is always going to give you a positive dead block together with its zero shifted by 1. And well, we have formulas for vertical, but it is missing, so it doesn't matter, and horizontal. And that's how you get the corollary and the precise statement I was giving. All right, so that thing is nice, except that, as I said, C is fully faithful. It's obviously not going to be full. I mean, if it was full, then that would be contradicting the fact that the true parameter persistence is very wide to have barcodes. But you can wonder what is essential image. It's kind of the story, and that's what I want to look at. All right. So we have to identify the image of the true parameter persistent things that arise as sheaves on R. We already know it contains actually level sets, but it will contain things which are different. And that's where we have to remember that, because we haven't really been using it that much, that sheaves satisfy some kind of local to global properties. This is going to be the thing that single them out in true parameter persistence in some sense. And so what this local to global property tells you something that it's pretty nice if you remember a classical algebraic topology, which is essentially the Mayer-Vietoris long exact sequence. Written in that way, in the sense that I'm taking the W was the cover before that. Well, too bad, but that's the way it is. So take an open W and UNV an open cover of W. And therefore, and it's written in the wrong direction. The arrows will go in the other direction. I'm sorry. But of course, since U and V are subsets, sub-open subset of W, and you have map from f of W to f of U and f of V, and therefore to the direction. And again, U intersection V is a subset of U and V, therefore you have maps in the other direction. And to take a minus sign, you get a map, an exact triangle, a triangle in the giraffe category of sheaves, meaning if you compose the two maps is 0. And the thing is that the property that we have for sheaves, or the fact that we have a complex of sheaves, is telling us that this thing is an exact triangle. What does that mean? That means that it's isomorphic in the giraffe category to something which is a short exact sequence of chain complexes. Or said otherwise, that's telling you that the first thing is the cone of the other map, the co-cone in the direction of the other map. Or said in other words, that means that if you pass to cohomology, you have a long exact sequence, cohomology which is equivalent to the Mayer-Vietoris long exact sequence. And therefore, since everything comes from sheaves, when we apply psi, things will have that property, and that motivates us to introduce the following notions, which are called Mayer-Vietoris systems in true parameter persistence modular comodules. So hopefully, I've been trying to write it for comodules, but that's possible that at some point I've been thinking module. But anyway, so I'm going to call graded true parameter persistent comodule. So M star will have like all degrees, possible degrees, to be given first as a persistent comodule on R2, which is 0 on the diagonal and below. And the persistent structure that give us, so if I'm looking to V square, which I've been describing, which is the value of M at the point AB, at the point XB, from XY and from AY, with the obvious relation, which are that A is smaller than X, and the B is smaller than Y. Square. Then when we have this square, we're in the same situation as before, because the persistent structure that tells us that we have a map from M of XY to M of XB and to M of AY, which give us the first map here. And again, the two other maps give us a map here, the minus in between, so that is 0 when we propose. Right. And now if you are assuming that M was of the form psi of F, and we remember that psi was essentially given by these push forward functors, then we can try to see what's going on when we compute M y, and we see that we're essentially looking at the value of f in the four following covers, which are opens, which are the interval minus xy, the interval minus xb, the interval minus ay, and their intersection, which is minus ab. So we're basically looking to a situation where we have a cover of minus xy by these two operands, and the lower corner of our square is the value of f in the intersection. And as we said before, that means that we get actually that this small sequence that we have here actually extends to a long exact sequence where we have the Mayer-Vietoris long exact sequence in the picture. All right. So, well, let's formalize that, but basically saying that a Mayer-Vietoris persistent system is first a two-parameter persistent module on what I call H plus, meaning on R2, which is 0 below the diagonal, and on the diagonal, and the data of the delta I. So the delta I, let's say we're just the connecting homomorphism, and they're coming from the connecting homomorphism in this Mayer-Vietoris long exact sequence, except that I have to tell you which one they are. So you have these maps. These maps, we assume that they are maps of persistence modules, and that they make the following sequence there exact, which you can see then tell you the long exact sequence, the longer exact sequence. So this thing forms a category with morphisms being the obvious morphism that commutes with all these structures. So just to do. That's like a persistent system. And then the expected theorem is the following: is that the essential image of psi is, I'm going to say wrong, that's okay, is the category of Mayer-Vietoris systems. It's kind of wrong because, of course, when I'm saying that, I mean that when I've been writing Mayer-Vietoris system, I've been looking to the derived category, and I've been taking cohomology, so that I give you graded things. So I'm basically being translated what was the essential image and the property of the essential image on DB to the cohomology. So that's what I mean by the equivalence in two parentheses. All right, and psi is an isometry between convolution distance and the interleaving distance you can define for Mayer-Vietoris systems with the prerequisite of this maps have to commute with everything, all the structure I've been given. We're studying how you can compute all these things to, or you can reinterpret everything we've been doing in the level set 2 persistence in that level and with this property of Mayer-Vietoris. All right. So something that can be puzzling is that in some sense, I've been saying that in dB of R, when we are sending psi, we are something which was having an extra property. And in the image, I've been describing an extra structure because you have to give the delta. But just the reason is because I've been passing to cohomology, the property I have at the level of the derived category has to be given by the long exact sequence. It's the same idea that when you are in chain complexes, a short exact sequence of chain complexes, that gives you, when you pass to cohomology, a long exact sequence, and that's the data you need to have. All right. I don't know when I was supposed to stop actually, but. All right, so then I can say something slightly more about what you can do in higher dimension. But so let me just first return on the favorite example, which is now rewritten in the way it should be, as before, meaning everything with all the degrees at once. So on the right, that was the projection map from S1 to 0. It's on the green line. So if you look to what is its barcode, clearly it's just two birth barcodes, non-positive birth barcode, which is one in degree 0, one in degree 1, which corresponds to the fact that you only see S1 if your interval is 0. And you see globally S1, nothing in between. And the other barcode is really like you have a birth barcode which corresponds to the fact that well, I should say that you have two, depending on what the cohomology, you have one barcode which is the proof 1, and then you have two things which are dual, which are the depth block in degree 0 and the birth block in degree 1, so the k-1 there, which are linked together, and which really comes to the fact that if I was doing in sheaves, then the decomposition will just be that for the first thing, I will have like a closed line and an open line for sheaves in degree 1. And you can take the functor side to compute the convolution to see that thing. And you can actually even use this to just prove by n that the Italian distance in between these two things is exactly 1, which is the optimum, because obviously the infinite, the supremum distance between the function f and okay, what g or p, whatever was, is just 1. All right, so now let me say a few words on what you can do if you want to go at a higher level, and something I just mentioned, just that the theorem I've been giving at the end, so the fact that the essential image of size given by Mayer-Vietoris systems, it's kind of a decategorification of a theorem at the level of the other categories, which really means that a theorem that you are having by taking cohomology, and even more at infinity categorical enhancement. So you can do something at both. I will focus on the infinity categorical enhancement to see what condition we got. So the condition we got is that we were looking to square in R2. So if you remember my square, let's go back. Yeah, that's that square. The value of my persistence, the module at the point xy, xb, ay, ab. Right. So I have a four square, which I've been describing like this. You have B11, which is the top guy, and which is bigger than B01, B10, where you have been 1 0 at the dots, and you have B00 there. And then for any co-persistent functor from the Alexander things to see, or two persistent, yeah, co-persistent functor in chain complexes, then you get a map. From this picture, you just get a map from f of B1 to the limit of the f of the other sides of the square. So f of B01, f of B0, f of B10. I mean, that statement is just saying that if that the square is converging, that's what the statement says. And since I'm working with the right area, I really get something into the homotopy limit of that thing. Or again, the co-cone, if you work at the level of chain complexity, sees them at the level of chain complexity. All right. And the statement that we get from the fact that we have the local global property of sheaves before was precisely that this canonical map is an equivalence. So that's exactly what was given. All right. So I'm rephrasing here that definition by saying it's a special case of a way bigger notion due to Goodwillie, which is called one excited. By that saying that such a functor is one excited if it satisfies the property for all squares you have. So all ways of writing the square in your category C coming from this picture. That's what I mean by square from R2. So if it sends, so if it for all square, we have that f of B11 is equivalent to the homotopy limit of the rest. All right. And then if I'm rewriting the theorem with before, more, you see that now the essential image of psi is precisely the sub-infinity category of one excited functors in persistence. And now we only have properties. We don't need to translate. So I'm just going to say a few words. You know, why is it now popping up? So that the both can make sense for higher parameter, but it's vastly in progress. Because of course, this notion of one excited, you can make it for higher cubes. I mean, I can look at n+1 cubes in RD, this is bigger than n+1. Vi0, Vin, and having a similar, or I have a big cube, and I will have like the top one, which is the highest one, and I can look at natural map in the homotopy limit of the big diagram given by all the other vertices and maps, and ask that this thing is an equivalent, this canonical map is an equivalence with the homotopy limit. And that has a name, that's the name of n excited in general. Here we only have one excited because that was dimension 2, so we have nothing else, but we can have things in between. And so, kind of a question is that similarly, if you're looking to d-excited in d+1 parameter persistence, then we have something similar in the fact that this is going to be exactly the essential image of sheaf from RD sent to multi-parameter persistence in RD+1 by essentially the same formula as before. But then you can have like a whole hierarchy in between, and that's, I think, interesting to try to understand what it means, because it's somehow telling you something that was somehow hidden, is the fact that when I was doing level set persistence, in the end, I'm saying that the true parameter persistent of level set persistent in somehow one-dimensional in the sense it's coming of sheaves over R. And you can imagine that something which will be in G parameter persistence, which will be like nxz for n smaller than t, will mean that you're essentially looking at something which doesn't really have like G+1 parameter, but have like correlation in between these things. And that's to be a way of trying to see this kind of things. But anyway, that's where I want to stop. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. Any questions?
Yep. Can you, is it really hard to describe, or should you say a little bit more about this convolution product?
Yeah, I can say a little bit more, but the thing is that it's used not the direct image, so that's why it's hard to describe. Where is it? Just before. Yeah. So star actually really means that the first thing you do when you define the convolution, you take F and you take the external, what's called the box tensor product with that sheaf. That gives you a sheaf on R2 times R2. And then you use that. Well, R2 is a vector space. So in particular, if you have a map from R2 times R2 to R2, which is the addition.
Okay, so it's really a kind of deconvolution.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're basically using the proper direct image of that thing after. That's why I didn't really describe it, because it's annoying to describe. Yeah, that's where the convolution names come from.
Other questions? Actually, I had one which is, I mean, it departs from multidimensional persistence, but
fine.
Just because we're interested in some sort of generalized persistence on sets and even on categories. Are they sort of recipes or to go from cosets and doing the same construction to sheaves, using some even generalized topology within the category?
I mean, sheaves, yeah, we can basically do these things of sheaves whenever you have any sites on the category. The question is that if your poset, there's no really natural topological space to associate to it, it's not clear what you will get. But I'm guessing that in directed topology, you always have like some kind of topological space you want to think about it, so that
yes,
should be good.
Yeah. The poset is not any kind of poset.
When you use cohomology, you have also couplings and so on, and more structured at a different space. Thinking of capability somehow.
Yes, that's kind of actually related more to the very first thing I said I will not speak about today, but that's great you're asking. Yeah, that's the second point here. So you can, I mean, some people, including myself, have been trying to see what we can do if you add cut products. You can do way more things than doing cut products. I mean, you can put like steel rod operations and even like infinity structures and infinity structure or whatever. Well, take your favorite algebraic structure, homotopical algebraic structure that exists for spaces. You can study that in terms of persistence. There are some issues in some. There are some things which are really purely functorial that works the same. You can really define persistence, persistence algebras, CTGAs, and study interleaving distance for that. And check it's actually, we can even check on some examples, it's actually better invariant than the usual one, but harder to compute because we know you have to compute maps of algebra, so that's harder. You can try to do that with infinity algebras and other kind of algebras, and there you have to be careful because these things are not as functorial as you want. So I have some work where I've actually prove that for if you have something coming from, let me say, real life or but finite data, then you can actually make this into infinity persistence for you. But you do need like something finite in some sense, which is going to be complicated to study that and check that you get actually better invariant to some extent. And these ones are not so bad. So the infinity and steam world, at least for practical application that people have been doing in some example, are actually not so bad because of course you cannot compute the interleaving distance at once. But you can check that actually there are really, really strong conditions and that usually once you apply them, then there are very few bars you can really compare. So that's like to interleaving, but knowing that some bars only have to be compared with some other bars. That's it. Yes.
You suggest a brief word about your characterization of the essential image.
Yeah, so the idea going from there is essentially actually that writing the section of that is that if you start with something which is excessive, then it's very easy doing something which is too persistent excessive to actually construct out of it a sheaf on R, which is actually going to be an homotopy sheaf on R, just because the excessive is giving you like the change condition. And then you just have to check that this thing you get is essentially the same thing as the one we're starting with up to equivalence. And that's the way it is. I don't know if it answers all your questions. Yeah.
Other questions? Okay, so let's thank the speaker again. And then
Thank you. Je relise des trucs.